Good evening and welcome to the 610th episode of Travel Itch. I am Dan Schlossberg and we are in the 14th season of Travel Itch Radio, the show that lets you enjoy the pleasures of travel from the comfort of your armchair. Every week at this time, we talk to people representing destinations, hotels, airlines, railroads, car rental companies, and others in the world of travel and hospitality. From authors and bloggers to broadcasters and publicists. If it's got anything to do with travel, it's got everything to do with Travel Itch. And our guest today is travel writer Thomas Swick. Welcome, Thomas, to the new video version of Travel Itch Radio.
Thanks, Dan. It's nice to be here.
I love the title of your recent memoir, Falling into Place, a story of love, Poland, and the making of a travel writer. How did you come up with it?
Well, I kind of fell into it. It's, the title has two meanings. There's the falling into place meant literally because there are 7 chapters in the book and 6 of them are in different locales. So, and some of them are places that I did just kind of stumble into. I wasn't planning to end up there, but I did. So there's that aspect. And then the other, the idea of falling into place, everything working out. And in this book, it does. I set out to be a travel writer, and I end up getting a job as a newspaper travel editor. So it all did kind of fall into place.
When did it come out, and is it your first book?
It came out in November of 2023, and it is my 4th book and my first memoir. My 3 previous books were more travel books, and this is more about me, but there's also a travel aspect.
Who was your publisher and how did you hook up with them?
The publisher is Rowman and Littlefield, which has since been acquired by Bloomsbury. And I just pitched, I sent queries out to a number of publishers, and this is the one that expressed interest in it. So I was very happy.
We've been doing this show for 14 years, but never had a show on Poland. Obviously, it's not only an unsung destination, in your opinion, but also one of your favorite places. Why?
Well, I have an emotional attachment to Poland. I went there for the first time in 1978 for love. I'd fallen in love with a Polish woman. And other than that, I don't think I ever would have gone to Poland. And I ended up spending 2.5 years there. We married in Warsaw in 1980, 1 month after the beginning of the Solidarity movement, Lech Wałęsa and everything. So much was happening there then. So it was a fascinating time to be there. And after 16 months of Solidarity, martial law was declared. And I was there to witness that. So, I went through a lot with Poles. I worked to learn the language. I got a job teaching English, and I just, I saw what they went through, and I became very much attached. I read a lot of the literature, and it's a country that it's kind of like my second home. So yeah, that's why I'm such a big proponent of Poland. And I also, it's one of those countries that's kind of not on the tourist map so much, a little more so now, but for years, not many tourists went to Poland. And I've always been drawn to unsung places. I grew up in New Jersey, that's a pretty unsung place. And, and then spent 2.5 years in Poland. So I like the fact that it is a kind of under the radar. And, for travelers going there, it has a lot to offer. There's some really exceptional cities. Even Warsaw, which was very much destroyed in World War II, has become a very vibrant, very attractive city these days. It's got, a lot of people don't realize this. They think of Poland as a very flat country, but the mountains in the south, the Tatra Mountains, are really spectacular. And there in that region, you have a real mountaineer culture with its own dialect, its own customs, its own very distinctive music and folk art, and it's a really fascinating place to visit. And then the history, there's just for students of history, you get just from the 20th century. You have in Warsaw, you have the Warsaw Uprising Museum. You have a fairly new museum of the history of Jewish people, or the Jews who've lived in Poland for centuries, and it's a really extensive museum. You could spend an entire day there. And then in Gdansk, you have the Solidarity Museum, so you learn about the movement that began, as I said, in 1980, and that really eventually led to the dismantling of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War. So a lot of 20th century history is very much presented in Poland. So I just think it has a lot to offer.
Tom, you mentioned dialect. How big a setback was it for you with the language barrier? Did you speak Polish before you went there?
No, I didn't speak a word of Polish, and luckily I got a job teaching at an English language college in Warsaw, where all the teachers were Polish, but they all spoke excellent English. So, and most of my wife, well, at the time she was my girlfriend, most of her friends spoke some English. Now, young people pretty much all speak English in the cities, but no, that was a bit of a handicap because I wanted to learn the language if I was going to stay there. And it's a tough language. It's a very difficult language to learn. It's grammatically, it's complicated, and then the pronunciation is very difficult, at least for people who speak English.
So how did you learn?
What I did, I read a lot and I watched a lot of television. Just listening to it, there was whenever they showed, back then there weren't a lot of options on TV, but every once in a while they'd show Russian movies, and whenever they showed a Russian movie, they would have subtitles in Polish, but they'd also have a speaker who would read the subtitles over the voices of the Russian actors. So I would sit there with a pen and paper, and I would write down the words that I didn't know. And then when the movie was over, I'd go look them up in the dictionary. So I made these long lists of vocabulary words. Another thing I did, which I think is a good trick for learning a language, obviously audio tapes are fantastic because, you train your ear. But I also I think when you see words written, they're easier to remember. So I found a book in a bookstore one day of screenplays by a famous Polish director. And screenplays are great for learning a language because it's the everyday speech of everyday people. You read these sentences. It's unlike novels. We have a lot of description and adjectives you're not going to use in daily interactions. But the screenplays were extremely helpful. So yeah, a combination of watching TV, reading screenplays, then reading books and talking to people. The other thing is, like all newlyweds in Warsaw, we lived with family. And in this case, we lived with Hanya's aunt and her cousin. And her aunt was a very interesting woman, very expressive. She wanted to be an actress when she was young. It never happened. But I would just sit in the kitchen and listen to her for hours. And that she was a wonderful teacher, even without knowing she was teaching me. But she really helped me with my Polish. So yeah, those are the ways I learned.
Well, how much time have you spent in Poland? And was it love at first sight? In other words, did you get the idea for the book the first time you went there? And when was that?
Well, as I said, the first time I went was 1978. And no, it was not love at first sight. Warsaw, Poland back in those years was pretty drab. It wasn't, very few tourists came then. And it was a kind of a tough place to be. The weather was pretty harsh, very long winters. It took me at least a year to really develop an affection for the place, and then the affection became an attachment. an attachment to the place. But when I was first there for 6 months in the 70s, I didn't think of writing a book because it was such a short time. I really didn't. I couldn't have written a book with any authority. But when I came back in 1980, and then everything started happening, the Solidarity movement, and then martial law. It was the first time in my career as a writer when I thought, I have to write about this. I have to tell the world what I'm seeing. And I'd always kept a journal, at least since college. I'd kept a journal. And in Poland, it became a diary. Every day there were things I wanted to write down and remember. That second stay from 80 to 82, I definitely had the idea of writing a book. And when I came home, that was my first book. That's a book about Poland that is not definitely not about me. I keep very much out of that book. I mean, it's written in first person, but the story, I thought, the story of Poland and what it had been through was much more important than the story of me and my quest to become a travel writer.
In your opinion, Thomas, unsung places have a hidden beauty. They're not overpopulated with tourists, and you can see more and enjoy more. Is that true?
Yes, I think so. There are fewer tourists. The sites are not so crowded, but more importantly, the people who live there are much more receptive. We hear stories about people in Barcelona. In Barcelona now, apparently they're shooting water pistols at tourists. They're not happy. But when you go to places where there aren't many tourists, people really appreciate your presence. And if you've done a little reading about the place and you have intelligent questions about them, about the place, the everyday lives of the people, then they really warm up to you and you have a much more meaningful experience. I'm very much about, meeting the people. I'm not a big sightseer. When I go somewhere, I really want to get to know what life is like for the people who live there. And it's easier to learn those things when you go to a place where there are not so many tourists. But I will say this, you can still go to Paris, one of the most touristed cities in the world, and get away from the tourists. Go to a neighborhood where there are no tourists. And tourists follow a very set itinerary, and it's very easy, even in cities where they're prevalent, to get away from them and see what they're missing.
This is the 50th anniversary of Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar. How did that influence travel journalism?
That was a very influential book. It, as you said, it came out 50 years ago, 1975, and it's a book that Paul Theroux wrote. He was a novelist at the time, but he got this idea. He loved trains, and he was living in London as an expat, and he just took trains all through Europe, India, Southeast Asia, Japan, then came back home on the Trans-Siberian Express. He traveled everywhere by train except Afghanistan. They have no trains in Afghanistan, so he had to take buses. And it's just such an entertaining book because he didn't write about the sights. He wrote about the people, all the colorful characters he met on the trains and in the cities when he wandered around. And he just really captured, I think, the excitement of travel, the excitement of discovery. And the book, when it came out, was a huge success, not only with critics, but with the reading public. And it was such a success that publishers, all of a sudden, after many years, got interested in publishing travel books. And travel writing took off from 1975 all through the 80s. There were some publishers that came out with special imprints that only published travel books. And it was a real golden age of travel writing. England had always had great travel writing and a public that appreciated it. But now it was happening in the United States, which had always been a fairly insular country. But in the 70s, late 70s and through the 80s, Americans took an interest in the world, and they read these travel books that were wonderful, just great writing, great observation, wonderful perspectives, and it was a wonderful time. And that was the time I was starting out as a travel writer. And I thought, well, this is great. This is just going to continue. Well, it didn't, but it was good. It was nice while it lasted.
At Travelwitch, we love trains, trolleys, streetcars, funiculars, monorails, anything on tracks. Do you find trains the best way to get around Europe? And what about Poland specifically?
Yeah, I love trains. Even here with Amtrak, I just, there's something about being on the train. It's just so, it's such a perfect, to me, way to travel. And to me, it's slow travel, and you really get to see the places you pass through, and then you can get off in the different towns you stop at. Europe has great trains, and I've traveled a lot in Europe on trains. There's a section of this memoir where I take a series of overnight trains from Warsaw to Athens. It took 5 nights or 5 days of travel through basically Eastern Europe, most of Eastern Europe, to get to from Warsaw to Greece. Today, the trains are much better. Poland has a wonderful train, a high-speed train that starts, well, it goes from Gdansk in the north on the Baltic to Warsaw and then to Krakow, which are probably the three most attractive cities in Poland, though Wrocław in the west also has a claim to that title. But that train that goes, the high-speed train from Gdansk to Warsaw to Krakow is very comfortable, very efficient. It's a wonderful way to travel around Poland.
Tom, what are your favorite travel books and travel authors?
Well, Paul Theroux is up there. The British still, I think, are the best at the genre. There's a British writer named Jonathan Rabin who died a couple of years ago, and he focused his attention on the United States, which was interesting. To read. He was British, and he came to the U.S. and really examined us with humor, but with also a seriousness of purpose. And I think his books are some of the best, certainly some of the best writing about the United States. Very perceptive, very entertaining. There's another British travel. Oh, I should mention the 2 books of Rabin's that I like the most are Old Glory, where he gets a boat up in Minnesota and sails it the length of the Mississippi River, ending up in New Orleans. And he stops in little towns and goes to, church picnics and just talks to regular people. And it's a great book. His other book is one called Hunting Mr. Heartbreak, where he tries to recreate the immigrant experience. So he comes over from England on a container ship, stays in a woman's apartment in New York City. She's away, so he kind of imagines he's living the life of a New Yorker. Then he goes to a small town in Alabama and settles in there for a while, writes about that. Then he goes to Key West, and then he ends up in Seattle, where he eventually ended up living. But in these very different places around the United States, he really captures something about, I think, the American people, the American spirit. Another British writer I really like is Colin Thubrin, who's now in his 80s, like Paul Theroux, also in his 80s. Thubrin, I think, is just a fantastic writer because he has the intellectual capacity to interpret a place and understand what he's seeing, but he also has a good and open heart, so he can empathize with people and connect with them emotionally, and that combination makes for just a wonderful travel writer. So, and there are so many more. They're just in that period in the 70s and 80s when travel books were coming out seems left and right. There are just so many great writers. There's an American, Kate Simon, who wrote guidebooks in the 60s and 70s that kind of were an interesting mix of practical information. She told you about the hotels and the restaurants, but she also had really insightful essays that were real literary pieces, but she mixed them in with the practical information, and they're still worth reading because of those essays. So yeah, there are a lot of writers. I could go on for another show about all the writers I love.
Tom, in your opinion, what are the 7 joys of travel, and are 2 of them anticipating the trip or anticipating getting home?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned anticipating the trip, because to me, that's the first of the 7 joys of travel. And that's one that people tend to overlook. People kind of sometimes stress about getting ready and getting prepared for a trip, that they don't really savor that feeling of anticipation. What's coming. The Germans actually have a word for this feeling, Reisefieber, and it's kind of this anxiety mixed with joy at anticipating what's coming. So I think that is the first joy of travel. The second one is movement. Movement gives us pleasure. It's why mothers rock their babies, and I was talking about sitting on a train. There's nothing like that feeling when you're sitting in the station and all of a sudden the train slowly starts to move, and then you get out into the city and you see things very close and at a very human speed, and movement is another pleasure of travel, I think, that's overlooked. Another is break from routine. When we go traveling, we're not doing what we do every day at home, and that's a great that's a great joy. Novelty. When we travel, things are new. Everything, the sights are new, the tastes are new, the smells are new. Discovery is another joy of travel. The things we learn when we go away from home, especially when we go to another country. Then emotional connection. I talked about the importance of people, and then they give you information, they give you insight, but also sometimes they give you an emotional connection to a place, and that's invaluable. And I think the final joy is a heightened appreciation of home. In traveling, we can go to the most beautiful, exciting place, but then it also makes us think about how much we appreciate what we have at home, whether it be our hometown or our country. It opens our eyes to what we sometimes take for granted.
Tom, do you have any travel tips for tourists, especially those going overseas? I always hear about problems involving currency, customs, and culinary issues.
Yeah, my tip for most tourists is to just relax and enjoy. When I give travel writing classes to students, I give them a 3-prong approach. When I first arrive in the place, I really recommend walking. Just getting out and just wandering, with no plan, no real destination in mind, but just to wander and take everything in. As I said, the sights, the sounds, the smells. After you walk, you get tired. So sitting, I think, is very important, because when you sit, you can observe the people better. You were walking with them, but you weren't really observing them. But when you're sitting and you're removed from the crowds, you can see the way they dress, the way they greet each other, all those things. And then the final thing is, try to meet the people. Go where the locals go. Go to the laundromats and the sporting events and the concerts and the gallery openings, any place where you might find locals, and then talk to them. Try to establish a conversation, and who knows, a conversation may lead to an invitation, and if you get invited into someone's home, that's that's the holy grail of travel. You see how people live, and so those are some tips I would give to travelers to try to try to get to know the people and hopefully have an experience with them.
But is there such a thing, Tom, as the ugly American? Should an American in Europe mask the fact that he's from the USA?
I don't think so. I never do. I know it was fashionable even in the 70s when I started traveling. American backpackers would sometimes put little Canadian flags on their backpacks, and I just I think most people are smart enough to distinguish between the individual and his government, and I'm happy to be an American, and I don't see any reason to hide it. It's interesting. A few years ago, the New York Times did a little feature on how tourists have changed over the years, and they said that the Americans are the new Germans, because in the old day, the Germans used to travel very quietly, unassumingly. They didn't, they came from a rather shameful past, and they didn't, they wanted to keep a low profile. The Americans, the New York Times said, we're like that now. We're kind of keeping a low profile, while the Brits are the new Americans. The Brits are going, to these islands and having these bachelor parties and getting drunk and trashing places, and they're the new Americans. The Russians are the new Arab tourists, because the Russians have money now, and they're going around and buying up lots of property around the world. And the Chinese are the new Japanese. The Chinese are the ones now traveling in big buses and going around in tour groups and visiting places that they haven't seen. So it's interesting how that changes.
You're talking with author and travel writer Thomas Swift. Tom, let's talk domestic travel. You say Florida is not as weird as most people think. Would you mind explaining, please?
Well, you've heard about Florida Man, I assume. The stories that come out of Florida are very sensational, because sensationalism sells. Many of the books, the novels written about Florida are kind of outrageous, all about these crazy things that people do. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but the majority, the vast majority of people here in Florida, we live normal lives, just like everybody, just like people in the rest of the country. We just happen to be surrounded by palm trees, and we have alligators sometimes, but it's not as crazy a state as people think, and I think it's a very attractive state. It's unlike anywhere else in the United States. It's a mix of, you have this subtropical climate and foliage, just these fantastic trees and flowers and fruits. Mango season every June is just one of the highlights, one of the best things about living here. And it's got a lot of, and it's got people from all over the world. We have, immigrants from Cuba and South America, and we have transplants from New York and New England, and then now we're getting them from California and Texas, and we have a lot of Europeans, and it's just I think it's a really intriguing mix of peoples and cultures, and I recommend it.
We're talking with travel writer Thomas Swift. You talk about over-tourism. Isn't that the same thing that Yogi Berra said when he said that restaurant is so crowded nobody goes there anymore?
Yeah, in a way it is. I first went to Portugal in 1989, and it was a trip to Spain and Portugal. When I got to Portugal, there were hardly any tourists, and I got this wonderful reception. People were very kind and very accommodating and welcoming. And then I went a few years ago, and the tourists were all over Lisbon, but the people hadn't changed. The Portuguese are still very gracious, and it's still one of my favorite countries. But the over tourism is a problem, definitely. And as I said, I think when you're planning a trip, it's something to consider. Consider maybe going to the place that's not as popular, that's kind of off the tourist map, that where you may have, you may not see the spectacular sights that you would have had you gone to the other place, but you may have a more interesting experience. You may have some interesting encounters with people. So over tourism, from a tourist perspective, I think is not a big problem. There are ways to get around it.
Tom, I'm going to ask you the question that I get asked the most. What made you a travel writer? How did you become a travel writer?
Well, I actually set out to be a travel writer. I majored in English at college, and I wanted to be a writer, and I knew at that point I had absolutely nothing to write about. I had spent my entire life in school, sitting in the classroom. So I decided if I wanted to be a travel writer, I should speak another language. And I went to France for a year, specifically to learn French. And I spent the school year in an institute for foreign students to learn the basics of French. And then when the school year ended, I didn't want to come home because my French was just getting to be decent. And I found a job on a farm. I studied in Provence, in the south of France, but the farm was in the northeast, in Alsace, which was completely different terrain, different culture than Provence. And I lived with a farm family for the summer. Excuse me. And it was a great experience. My French got to be very good because they didn't speak any English. And I had an experience to write about because, again, I'd been in school and in learning French, but on a farm, I was doing things I'd never done before, milking cows and baling hay. And so that's how I became a travel writer, really, just going abroad, having experiences, and then putting them on paper.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to add?
No, I would just, what I said earlier about the, appreciating the joys of travel, really kind of soaking it in, and just going to some of the less popular places and talking to the people, just finding out what it is that makes them what they are.
Our guest today on Travel Itch has been travel journalist and author Thomas Swick. Thank you, Tom, for visiting with us.
Thanks so much, Dan. I enjoyed it.
I did too. And viewers, now that the baseball pennant races are in their final days, this is the perfect time to share the excitement with my latest book, The New Baseball Bible, Notes, Nuggets, Lists, and Legends from Our National Pastime. Both a bathroom book and a coffee table book. It's an unorthodox illustrated history that is really everything you want to know about baseball, but we're afraid to ask. That's The New Baseball Bible. Get it today on Amazon.com. And that's it for this edition of Travel Itch Radio. This is your host and writer, Dan Schlossberg, saying thank you for your time this time. Until next time, next week, we'll talk with Jen Bowes about Wilmington, Delaware. For now, good night and stay safe. Never get this thing to work right. Eventually, it'll come.